In this video, I'll explain what a constructive dilemma is, especially through the means of explaining the trolley problem. I'll talk about why it's a logical argument form, and I'll also give you some possible counters to this kind of an argument form. Hello, my name is Chico. Welcome to the Philosopher Show Introduction to Propositional Logic course. In my philosophy class, I typically like to teach through conversation. I like to present some kind of idea, or in this case, a dilemma, some kind of problem that maybe we can discuss. And I hope that the different possible views come out organically through our discussion, and then we take off from there and explore those possibilities. And one of my students' favorite problems is the trolley problem. The trolley problem goes something like this. By the way, it's not just my students. People throughout philosophy, for some reason, have gravitated towards this interesting problem. I mean, you can find internet memes on this. You can find entire Instagram accounts that are dedicated to trolley problem memes. Let's say you're walking along, minding your own business. There are no people around, and you're crossing over a railroad track. And typically this problem is given as a trolley. And for me, I don't know, a trolley just seems so weak. I know it would kill you, but let's just pretend like it was a train instead. So you're crossing over a train track, and you hear a train in the distance, woo woo, and you're like, oh, this is nice. And then you look over, and to this side, you see that, oh my goodness, there are 5 people that have been tied down to the railroad track. So they're actually like going to die. And there's no way you can get to them in time. This train is coming so fast. There's just no chance for you to get down there, untie these 5 people, and save their lives. So you're not sure what you're going to do. You see that there's a switch at the railroad crossing that you're at that says that if you pull this switch, the train will actually go off in a different direction. You're like, oh, sweet, I'm going to pull that switch. And right before you pull that switch, you look over to that side and you realize there is one person tied down on that side right over there. So the question is, should you pull that switch and send the train off to that other side and kill that one person? Now, what's interesting is, for some people, they're right off the bat like, of course you should, right? It's 5 versus 1, obvious. For other people, right off the bat, they're like, well, of course you shouldn't. I mean, you'd be actively choosing to kill that one person in order to save the 5 people. I even have entire classes that right off the bat just totally agree and look around like, okay, now what's the problem? And you're like, I'm just sort of like, that was the problem? I don't know. And I had to end up arguing for the other side just to generate some conversation. Now, although this video isn't actually about the trolley problem, it's really more about a dilemma, a constructive dilemma, and how that argument form works. It is still kind of fun to talk about. So let's, just in case you were worried, like, well, I chose right off the bat. It seemed obvious to me to choose one over the other. I don't see what the problem is. You could tweak this a little bit and maybe make it a little bit more difficult for you to see, which one you would choose. So if you were like, it's wrong to pull that switch, obviously that is murder. Imagine instead there are like 500 people on the one track, and you would just be killing one person. Would that change your mind at all? What if it was the entire world and just one person over on the other side? Would you still choose just the one person? And if you thought, for sure, I would kill the one person, obviously save the 5 lives, then you could tweak it a little bit as well. Imagine a husky gentleman is sitting on a bridge overlooking this railroad fiasco about to happen. And it wasn't that there was one guy tied to one side and there was no switches or anything like that. It was just 5 people tied down on the railroad tracks. And you're walking along and you see this trolley cruising through, and you realize you could push this guy over the side of the bridge, thereby killing him, but stopping the trolley and saving the 5 lives. And I realized there, I always have students like, well, why couldn't you jump off? And let's just pretend like that was the only thing that you could do. I mean, I could kind of tweak it so that was like your only choice. But let's just say that that's your only choice. Now it feels like a little bit more visceral that you're pushing a guy off. Or the best variation I heard was, imagine you were a doctor in a small mountain town, let's say, that's isolated from most places, and you have 5 people that are going to die the next day because they haven't gotten some vital organ transplant. Let's say there was organs on the way and the train, I don't know, the train went off the tracks because somebody pushed a fat guy in front of it, and the organs don't show up, and there you are, befuddled. How am I going to save these people's lives? All the nurses and everything go home for the day, and you're all by your lonesome, and you hear a knock on the door. You open the door and somebody walks in and says, "Hey, I'm not from around here. I was just wondering if I could get a quick physical." And you say, "Oh, I guess so." And you're sort of perfunctorily going through the motions of physicalizing this person. And as you get in the conversation, this person, let's say, you realize that this person is a total stranger, knows nobody, not only knows nobody in your town, but really has no ties whatsoever. You ask, "So, where's your family from?" "Well, really, my family is all gone." "What about your friends?" "Well, I don't really have any friends. I just travel from town to town." "Oh, really? Well, why did you come here?" "I just sort of drifter. Nobody really knows I'm here," right? You find out through blood work, let's say, that this person is an exact match for those 5 people. Now, nobody knows that this guy has come into your hospital. Let's say this small town is like no cameras anywhere. I don't know how organ transplants are going to happen in this small town, but let's just say they are. So you realize you have to give this guy a shot. You realize you could put this guy to sleep, harvest his organs, use those in the transplants, and then incinerate this guy in, let's say, the incinerator downstairs, and nobody would know the difference. Would you save these 5 lives by killing this one person? And that one, to me, is like the most difficult version of that. But in any case, this whole setup right here is of an argument form called a constructive dilemma. The symbolized form of this looks something like this. If you don't throw the switch, you do not throw the switch, so let's say N for no switch, then you will allow 5 people to die. We'll say F. So if N, then F. And you allow 5 people to die. Just imagine like if there weren't another guy that's tied down on that other track and you didn't throw the switch, you'd feel guilty, right? Like you'd feel like, oh, I should have saved those 5 people. I had the chance. All I had to do was throw the switch. So let's say that's your first premise here. If N, then F. If you do throw the switch, let's say S, then it's the case that you will kill one person, then K. So if S, then K. You really have only 2 options here, either N or S. Either you don't throw the switch or you do throw the switch. So let's say N or S for premise 3 here. And then the conclusion, you can see like you're either going to get N or S. So one of those conditionals is going to get its antecedent. That means you're going to get the consequent of one of those conditionals. So for the conclusion, either you let 5 people die, F, or you kill one person, K. So the whole point of a constructive dilemma is that we have at least 2 conditionals here, and both of them, for their consequence, have something that we don't like, something that we definitely don't want. And then we have a disjunctive premise that forces us to choose one of the antecedents. And then we have a disjunctive premise that forces us to choose between the antecedents of those conditionals. By the way, you can have more than 2 possibilities here. You could have 3, 4 conditionals if you wanted to. The point would be that they all led to some consequent that you didn't want. So you have a disjunctive that forces you to choose between all those antecedents. And so in the conclusion, we see, well, then you're going to get one of those consequences, something that you don't want. So let's look at the argument form, though, abstracting from the way that we have it set up here with the N's and the S's. We'll replace those basic propositions with well-formed formula variables, and it should look something like this. If alpha, then beta. If gamma, then delta. Either alpha or gamma, therefore either beta or delta. And whereas beta or delta would be things that you don't want. Now, you may have noticed this, but in our trolley problem example, there's actually an even more powerful way to put it. Instead of saying N for you do not throw the switch, really we could have said not S. And not S would have made premise 3 even more powerful, because premise 3 would be either not S or S, which is a tautology, as we saw it. If you don't remember what tautology is, go back and check the video on that. But tautology is just necessarily true. So we wouldn't even have to argue for premise 3. It's necessarily true, by the way, in classical logic. There are other logics that take issue with that. But in classical logic, which is what we're doing here, it's necessarily true. So if we were to set things up like that, premise 3, I wouldn't even have to argue for. I wouldn't even have to claim like, well, here's why I believe premise 3. And it is an instance of this constructive dilemma argument form, because not S is replacing alpha here. Remember, you're allowed to do that. Alpha can be replaced by any sized well-formed formula. So if we were to do it that way, it would be even better. It would be much more powerful constructive dilemma. However, that's not the only possible constructive dilemma, so that's why I use the N, just to show you the most general form that we can have. And as I said before, I like to use this constructive dilemma argument form as a heuristic device to force us into some kind of uncomfortable decision. So we have to think about what exactly is it that makes something, for example, the right thing to do. Is it just a numbers game? Do I look at, all the consequences that come out of this and say I have to choose the one that has the best ultimate result? Or are there some just rules that you don't break, like you never actively kill someone, even if that means having to allow some people to die? What is it that makes an ethical decision the right thing to do? However, constructive dilemmas can be used for more than just heuristic devices. So sometimes they're put forth as sort of an argument against a theory. Somebody has a theory, and a person that's objecting to that theory will say, if this theory is true, then it presents us with this dilemma, and there's no way out of this dilemma, so we shouldn't hold to this theory. As an example, some people put forth what's called the Euthyphro Dilemma. And the Euthyphro Dilemma attempts to say that if God is the determiner of what is good and evil, then either he just chooses what is good and evil capriciously, and he could have picked anything, including things that would be we would consider very bad, or he chose because there was already good and evil to do certain things, in which case there is some moral law that's even greater than him that he doesn't have control over. Either way, either God is not all powerful in the second case, or God determines things capriciously. In the first case, seems like we don't like that stuff. If you're interested in that, check out my 3-video series on that, where I look at both of those horns of the dilemma, they call it, and a possible third solution that we could have. But hopefully you could see that, this can be a very powerful instrument of reasoning. So that's only the case if this is a valid argument form. So let's see if this is a valid argument form. First, I have to set up my truth table where I have, all the T's and F's distributed based on all the possible combinations of trues and falses for alpha, beta, gamma, and delta. And as we can see, since there are 4 well-formed formula variables, there are 16 possible combinations. And oh my gosh, I do not want to go through all those. So I'm going to have to think about how to do this in a more intelligent manner. And when I think about what is it that makes an argument form invalid, it's having at least one row where you have true premises and a false conclusion. If you never have that in any of the rows, then it's a valid argument. So that means it's only the case that when the conclusion is false, that we have an opportunity for that row to count as making the argument form invalid. And let's look at the conclusion here. It's a disjunctive. And when I think about the disjunctive, it's only false when both disjuncts are false. And that only happens in rows 6, 8, 14, and 16. So really, those are the only rows that I have to check, because those are the only times when the conclusion is false, and thereby, could make this argument form an invalid argument form. So now I have to look at those premises and see, in any of those rows, are all the premises true? If in at least one of those rows, all the premises are true, then I know it's an invalid argument form. So let's check it out. In premise 1 and 2, we have conditionals. And conditionals are only false when the antecedent is true and the consequent is false. So let's look at those rows and see, is it ever the case that we have true antecedents and false consequence? And yes, in rows 6 and 8, I see that the first premise has a true antecedent and false consequent. So in those rows, premise 1 is false. And then for premise 2, rows 6 and 14 has the antecedent true and the consequent false. Although for row 6 it doesn't really matter because just one false premise in there makes it so that you don't have all true premises and a false conclusion. But in row 14 here, premise 2 is going to be false because it has a true antecedent false consequent. What about row 16 there? Well, in row 16, premises 1 and 2 are both true. But premise 3 has false disjuncts for both disjuncts in that disjunctive. So that sounds crazy. So this is a false disjunctive. Premise 3 is false in row 16. That means in none of these rows do I have all true premises and a false conclusion. This is a valid argument form. So any argument that is an instance of this argument form is going to be valid, including the first way that I presented this ethical dilemma, the trolley problem, and the second way where I switched it with not S, was it, I think? Yeah, not S instead of N. Both of those are instances of this argument form because in one case, N substituted for alpha, the other case, not S substituted for alpha. So they're both instances of this argument form, therefore they're both valid arguments. One other potential instance of this kind of argument form that could be pretty powerful, remember that any one of these well-formed formula variables can be replaced by the same well-formed formula. That means that beta and delta can actually be replaced by the same well-formed formula. So sometimes you have constructive dilemmas where, although you have different antecedents, the consequences are all the same. So you're always going to have the same outcome. And they're meant to show that, no matter what we do, we have this outcome. So, for example, in philosophy of free will, some philosophers who want to say that we don't have free will present the following dilemma. If our choices are determined by something, then we are not free. And they typically say that because, we can't choose to do otherwise, and they think that that's necessary for being free. But if our choices are not determined by something, we are also not free. And typically they will argue for this by saying, if they're not determined by anything, then they just happen by, lucky chance. Then they are totally capricious, totally haphazard. So it's not the case that we're controlling them because, nothing is controlling them. Now, either our choices are determined or they're not determined. Therefore, either we are not free or we are not free. So notice, that disjunctive right there, not free or not free, really that is just we're not free. At least one of these two things are true, but they're both the same thing. So, right, this thing is true. That's all we're saying. So this is another instance of this argument form, a constructive dilemma. And I could actually go back and show you, with a truth table how this works, but I don't really need to because I've already shown that the former constructive dilemma argument form is a valid form. So this is an instance of that. Therefore, it's valid. It's valid, but that doesn't mean necessarily that the conclusion is true, right? You can actually counter some of these dilemmas. So let me show you 3 possible ways where you can counter a dilemma. Remember, when I say counter a dilemma, I don't mean we're doing this because we want to just win an argument. If someone presents us an argument and we see it and we think, oh man, that's interesting. Is this argument legit? Should I believe the conclusion here? Now we're evaluating and seeing, does it actually work? And we've actually already seen that logically speaking, the form of this argument is a valid form. So remember that an argument is only sound when the premises are all true and the argument form is valid. So we've already seen that this is a valid argument. Now our only question is, are the premises true? Rejecting the truth of one of the conditionals is a strategy called taking the dilemma by the horns, where the horns of the dilemma are one of the conditionals. And of course, like I said before, you could actually have more than one. You can have you can have a trilemma if you wanted to. Qui-Gon Jinn has presented a trilemma in Philosophy of Mind, and Qui-Gon Jinn always sounds like a Jedi, so that's a cool name. But in any case, you take one of the horns. I don't know why this metaphor, like you're wrestling a bull or something. I'm not sure what the metaphor is supposed to refer to, but you're taking one of those conditionals and you're saying this horn of the dilemma is not legit. It's a false horn of the dilemma. So in our example here, for premise 1, I might say that being free just means doing what we want, in which case it doesn't matter whether our decisions are determined or not. They could be determined by us, and if they're determined by us, then they are free decisions. Or the second premise I can reject by saying decisions are determined by agent causation, and even if agent causation isn't something that's determined, by some outside source, it's internally. I don't know. There are, in other words, and I'm not saying I'm picking one or the other. I'm saying here are the ways that you might reject one of the horns of this dilemma. A second strategy that you can have is to reject the premise that is the disjunctive premise. So you can say, hey, you've only presented me with 2 options here. Now there are more than 2 options. This is called splitting the horns of the dilemma. If you only have 2 horns, assuming this is not a trilemma or something like that, then you present a third one, and that's splitting the horns. In our free will example, it's kind of hard because, our choices are either determined or not determined, and it's, that is necessarily true. So it's going to be hard to argue against that one, at least in classical logic. You could say that, determined or not determined is too general. I don't know, but let's pick a different one just for the sake of demonstration. In our fat man example, I always have students, like I think I said this, that students that say, why don't you jump yourself and try to stop the trolley from going rather than pushing the fat man? And that would be presenting a third option. What they're trying to do is say, look, these aren't the only 2 possibilities here. You can present a third possibility. So that premise that only gives us an either or, it should say either one or another or a third possible things. I've split the horns of the dilemma. The final tactic that we can have here, I'm not totally sure if I buy it. It's presenting a counter dilemma. So, somebody presents you a dilemma, then you present a dilemma right back. This works particularly if you are, if somebody's presenting a dilemma as an objection to your theory. What you could do is say, oh, well, not having my theory would also have a dilemma, and here's my other dilemma. And like I said, I don't know if I totally like that. Sounds like a lot like a tu quoque, which is you present a problem for me and I say, well, you have a problem too. Okay, well, now where are we? But an example of this might be if sometimes people will say, you want to have your cake and eat it too, which is a bizarre saying. But to me, it sounds like what they're saying is this. If you eat your cake, then you will no longer have it. If you keep your cake, then you will not be able to eat it. Either you're going to eat your cake or you are going to keep your cake. Therefore, either your cake will be gone or you won't get to eat it. And that seems like a dilemma, okay? A counter dilemma might sound something like this. If I eat my cake, then I will enjoy it. If I keep my cake, then I'll have it forever. Either I'm going to eat my cake or I'm going to keep my cake. Therefore, I will either get to enjoy it or I'll get to have it forever. And counter dilemma. Yeah, like I said, I don't know. I mean, that just sounds like we're just running around in circles. Okay, great. So I think probably strategies 1 and 2 are the best for countering a dilemma. I don't know. I promised you lots of fun in this episode because we were going to talk about the trolley problem. When I present it now, I realize, it's not quite as fun if you don't have people actually talking. If we can't actually have a dialogue and where people are bouncing ideas off of each other. So I'm kind of bummed about that a little bit, but maybe you could talk about it in a friend circle. Bring it. You should definitely bring that up in a party or like just when you're hanging out with your friends and watch minds get blown and tweak it just a little bit like I did to see, let them go off on a tangent about what they think for sure this is what makes something right, and then bam, you drop it on them. Oh yeah, what if there are 500 people there? What are you gonna do now? Hot shot. So yeah, it's kind of a fun thing to do. In any case, next video we'll talk about disjunctive syllogisms, and I'll talk also about something that he doesn't present in the book, which is affirming an alternate, which is a logical fallacy. And I will see you in that video. Adios.